Good evening, everybody, and welcome to The Trouble Begins, brought to you by the Mark Twain House Museum. My name is Jody DeBrine, and I am delighted to be your host for the evening for another Trouble event. Tonight, we are joined by Kent Rasmussen, Kevin McDonald, Barbara Schmidt, and Patrick Ober to discuss the critical insights of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, a new book that has just come out. Despite its popularity in literature, this is the first entirely original collection of critical analysis of the novel ever published. So we're very excited to be talking about this tonight. The Trouble Begins series is made possible mostly from the Center for Mark Twain Studies in Ober College. We thank them for their very many years of support of this program. The series is also supported by Webster Bank. If you'd like to support the Mark Twain House and the Trouble Begins series, I will drop a link in the chat for you to make your own donation. All donations are welcomed, and they help us produce these things and make them possible, and it's just great. $5, $10, as many dollars as you want. We appreciate that. I just popped that into the chat. Feel free to talk amongst yourselves during the program. Any funny witticisms you want to share, your favorite part about Adventures of Tom Sawyer, feel free to put those in the chat. But if you have a question for any of our panelists, if you look down at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A feature. Pop your question into there, and I'll make sure we get to it at the end of the program. Whew, that's all the admin stuff. So let me introduce our guests. First, we have Kent Rasmussen, the editor of tonight's book. He decided to make a hobby of reading everything Mark Twain published and compiling a collection of quotes in a modest book called The Quotable Mark Twain. Kent is also the author and editor of Mark Twain A to Z, Mark Twain for Kids, The Critical Companion to Mark Twain, as well as many other books, articles, and essays. Kevin McDonald, a regular here on The Trouble Begins, is a leading Mark Twain scholar and collector of books and memorabilia who lives in Austin, Texas. He has co-edited multiple Twain books and articles and has reviewed over 50 books for the Mark Twain Forum. Patrick Ober is a medical doctor and professor of internal medicine at Wake Forest School of Medicine in North Carolina. Several times recognized as the best doctor in America. He has also been honored with the Association of American Medical Colleges Distinguished Teacher Award. In 2003, he combined his medical expertise with his lifelong love of Mark Twain to publish his highly acclaimed Mark Twain in Medicine, Any Mummy Will Cure. And then lastly, but not least, Barbara Schmidt is a much appreciated independent Mark Twain researcher who has become legendary for the wealth of useful materials she makes available on the web and generously shares with other scholars and Mark Twain admirers. In 1997, she launched one of the earliest Mark Twain websites, twainquotes.com, a site I use almost on a daily basis, devoted to accurately documenting Mark Twain quotations and biographical information. Since then, she has used the site to publish her own research as well as groundbreaking research of other scholars. Welcome to all of you. I am so glad that you guys are all here. Let's get you all unmuted and get you chatting. All right. All right, you're all live.
I had to click on something to unmute.
Yep, you're good. So Kent, being the editor of this book, let's first hit it off by asking, how did this book come to be? How did you, choose the contributors? How did, it's such a wide range of topics in this book. How did it get going?
Let me back up a bit and say something quickly about how I got interested in Mark Twain. It occurred to me, I was thinking about this program earlier today, that this year, 2022, is actually, hard to believe, the 70th anniversary of the first time I read Tom Sawyer as a boy. I'm pretty sure it was actually 1952. And I don't know about the rest of you, but that sounds like a long time ago to me. Almost halfway back to the time the book was first published. I have loved Mark Twain and Tom Sawyer ever since I first read the book. I imagine I've read Tom Sawyer well over 10 times by now. When I started working on this book, was it the fall of 2021? One of the first things I did was reread the entire book another 3 times. But I edited this book because of my long-term relationship with Salem Press. I was a reference book editor for them for many years. Excuse me, by the way, I find I keep looking down. I'm finding it hard to make eye contact. The camera is above what I'm looking at on the screen. I'm not trying deliberately to avoid looking at the people. Anyway, I edited the Critical Insights volume on Mark Twain himself back when I was still working for Salem Press. And after I left, my primary ambition was actually to edit a collection of essays on Connecticut Yankee, which is one of my favorite Mark Twain novels. So I lobbied the publisher about that, and their marketing people didn't think there was sufficient market for that. And they talked me into editing critical insights on Huckleberry Finn, which to which both Kevin and Barb, sorry, did you contribute to that? I can't quite remember. And just this last year, I can't remember whether I approached Salem again about Connecticut Yankee or they approached me, but we agreed in the fall of 2021 to do this volume on Tom Sawyer. And I made a remarkable discovery to which you've already alluded in your introduction. The book came out, what did we say, almost 150 years ago. But the remarkable thing is, despite the fact that the book is so famous, it's been in print this whole time, this collection, Critical Insights, Adventures of Tom Sawyer, is the first published collection of entirely original essays on Tom Sawyer that has ever seen print. And how the heck could that happen? Well, one of the answers, I think, comes in one of the first essays in the book. Alan Gribben, a very distinguished Mark Twain scholar who's been working in the field for well over 50 years, wrote an essay, and I'm looking at the table of contents, Tom Sawyer, a classic overshadowed by its successor. And the theme of his essay is simply that because Huckleberry Finn is the sequel to Tom Sawyer, and Huckleberry Finn is so readily acknowledged as a true masterpiece, it's often compared, or Tom Sawyer, I should say, is often compared to it and found wanting. Huckleberry Finn is clearly a superior book, but because of its superiority, people have tended to dismiss Tom Sawyer. And one of the things I think our present collection does is establish that while Tom Sawyer can't really compete with Huckleberry Finn, it's certainly a great book in its own right, with a lot of dimensions that have been overlooked. Some of the essays in the book include, well, a surprising one. The editor of the Mark Twain Journal, Joe Fulton, wrote an essay with the unlikely title, Thinking Like Jackson's Island, or Why Tom Sawyer is Good for the Environment. It's a very eye-opening piece on aspects of the novel that deal with the natural world. And as I said in my introduction to this book, you read the essay and you're constantly asking yourself, why didn't I think of that before? It's a lovely eye-opener. Another interesting essay that has a subject that's intrigued me for a while is the comparison between Tom Sawyer and Harry Potter. I've long thought, I've read all the Potter books myself, and I've long thought that Tom Sawyer must have influenced J.K. Rowling, the Potter book author. I've never found any evidence that she has publicly acknowledged any debt to Mark Twain, but in Philip Bader's essay comparing the Tom Sawyer to Harry Potter, he raises so many points of comparison between the characters and themes in the book. It's hard to imagine that Rowling wasn't influenced, at least indirectly. Well, I'm not going to try to cover every essay in the book, but another thing about the book that has been controversial for at least 40 years is the question of whether the book is a nightmare vision of of boyhood and thus an inappropriate book for young readers to read. Pat Ober, who you'll hear from in a moment, addressed that topic. And I found his essay to be one of the more exciting contributions to the book, of taking a subject that we've seen discussed so many times and finding new aspects of it and coming up with new and quite delightful conclusions about that. One of our other contributors here, Kevin McDonald, looks at the question of whether Tom Sawyer is a traditional boy book or a coming of age novel. And he has some nice insights on that. And of course, Barbara Schmidt covered the illustrations in the book. I originally was thinking of an essay on the original illustrations only, which were drawn by a fellow named True Williams back in the 19th century. But Barb, being a prodigious researcher and natural bent, is always looking for more. She covered the entire history of Tom Sawyer illustration. To me, illustrations are a form of interpretation of the text. Illustrations are fun in their own right, but the people who illustrate books are in effect interpreting the author's intentions. So Barb found a lot of interesting insights as to what the artist must have been thinking. And I don't think anybody who pays attention to the illustrations and wonders what the illustrators are doing can help but go back and wonder about the author's intention, and thereby find even more depth in Mark Twain's writings. My own contribution to the book is on a subject that has interested me greatly the last several years, and that's film and television adaptations of the novel. I regard adaptations as another form of textual interpretation, so I get into that. Perhaps I'll comment on that in some detail a little bit later. But right now, just to keep this moving along, perhaps Pat can pick up the what?
So Kent approached me with the topic, which is actually a topic I had not thought about before. Is this an idyllic dream or is this boy's nightmare? And you think about it a little bit. And as a child, wow, there's nothing better in the world than freedom, especially freedom from adults, because adults have all these rules and sometimes they're kind of boring and sometimes they're restrictive. And if you ever watch kids at play and they don't know adults are around, they can be inventive, they can be creative. I think that's where we all grow and develop. Along the way, we make mistakes and we learn from our mistakes, and hopefully that's all part of the growing up process. So you start, here's the story of Tom Sawyer, and he's in bed and there's a mewing of a cat outside, except it's not really a cat. It's his buddy Huckleberry Finn. So let's get out of the house. Man, get out of the house and let's see what old Huck's up to. And he's got this dead cat. And now you got this conversation going about what's a dead cat good for. Well, maybe it can cure some warts, but we're going to have to go over to the cemetery and do some stuff. All of which is good fun, and it's some conversation about the wartiest boy in town because he didn't know how to use spunk water correctly, and if he'd only done it right, he wouldn't be the wartiest boy in town anymore. And now all of a sudden, whoa, we go from good fun to we're in the cemetery. What's happening? There are some people digging up a grave. What is all that about? Which actually never mentioned to any degree in the book, and all of a sudden there's a murder. And the guy that gets accused of the murder didn't do the murder. He sort of passed out at the time. And so now here's Tom and Huck in this amazingly bizarre adult world. They have witnessed a murder. They're not even supposed to be out and about. Well, Huck can go wherever he wants, but Tom's not supposed to be out and about. And what if we report this? What kind of trouble are we going to get into? And so some of the critics say, wait, that's way too heavy a load for a kid's book. You just cannot have that happen, cannot do that. But what happens along the way as Tom and Huck both start to deal with their worries, their fears, their concerns, but they can't tell an adult because adults live in this other kind of world. But what do we do about Muff Potter? Muff is in prison. Muff, man, they may kill Muff or something for this thing he didn't do. And so the whole tension around that is just a phenomenal thing. And then something interesting happens that's maybe not paid a lot of attention to. So Tom and Huck feeling a little guilty about, oh, maybe there's something nice we can do for Muff. So in the middle of the night, they go to the jail. And one of them climbs on the shoulders of the other and through the bar of the jail saying, hey, here, Muff, here's some tobacco, here's some matches, here's some smoking stuff you can do. We want to give you a gift. And obviously some of that's the guilt stuff going on. And Muff says, well, you boys are the only people in this town that even care about poor old Muff. So there's a sense of compassion, there's a sense of guilt going on, all these things blending together. But the fascinating part of that is that Sam Clemens, Mark Twain, didn't just pull that story out of the air. That was a story he sort of kind of lived in his own right. So when he was growing up in Hannibal, Missouri, a tramp came through town and some younger boys started to tease the man, make fun of the man, abused him a little bit. And he runs in to Sam Clemens and asks for a match. And Sam gives him a match. Well, later on, the guy gets thrown in jail. And in the jailhouse, the man turns the place on fire. He strikes the match, straw burns, bedding burns. And now this man is at the prison bar screaming, get me out of here, get me out of here. The flames are behind him. And then the town, including Sam Clemens, watches this man burn. And Sam Clemens, Mark Twain, several times in other works, in his autobiography, Life on the Mississippi, talks about all these nightmares that he had. Every night he would go to bed and this burning man would come into his vision who was accusing him of murdering him. Now, Clemens had a tendency to feel guilty about a whole lot of things, whether he did or not. And so, so there's the picture that Kent's showing up of the man at the bars and all the fire behind. So Sam Clemens takes this horrendous, terrible event from his past and recreates it into part of the story of Tom Sawyer in a much, much downplayed fashion. And that's actually one of the fun aspects of looking into Mark Twain and his history, because how much of this stuff with Tom Sawyer's autobiography, some clearly is, some may or may not be, some is invention. So there's sort of this tension back and forth between, yeah, this is sort of a dream world for a boy to grow up in versus this is a terrible, frightful world with all these nightmares. And then some of it is the reality of, hey, this is the world we all live in. And maybe we can help negotiate through that by listening to these sorts of stories and reading these kinds of books. I'll stop there so everyone else will have some press time.
Kevin?
Well, one of the wonderful things about great works of literature is that they can inspire so many different approaches to studying them and understanding them and reading them and enjoying them. And Tom Sawyer is one of those great works of literature. It was the bestseller during Twain's lifetime, outsold Huck Finn. And when Kent sent out the style sheet for the contributors, he made a passing reference to don't fill your article up with a lot of scholarly quotes, like a quote from Wordsworth. And he said he wanted to stick to the novel Tom Sawyer. So of course I immediately thought, well, there's going to be a Wordsworth quote in my piece, and my essay is going to ramble out beyond the confines of Tom Sawyer, the novel. And one of the things in my approach was that you can look at Tom Sawyer two ways. You can approach it as a novel, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, or you can approach the character Tom Sawyer. And that's not a small distinction, because the character of Tom Sawyer lives on in Huckleberry Finn in a critical, essential way that works to the success of Huckleberry Finn. And then he comes back for Tom Sawyer Abroad and Tom Sawyer Detective. And then Twain brought him back in some fragmentary works that he didn't finish, like Tom Sawyer's Conspiracy and Tom and Huck Among the Indians. And so Tom Sawyer lives beyond the confines of the novel itself. I'm not the first person to point this out. And there are two other articles in the book, one by John Bird and the other by the Davises, that explore the character of Tom Sawyer beyond the confines of just the novel. But I also looked at the book from the perspective of Tom Sawyer as a boy's book in the tradition of 19th century boys' books, which were adults looking back autobiographically on their own boyhood and examining what it was like for a boy to be a boy. And I also looked at Tom Sawyer's role in Huckleberry Finn, where he's the same kid, but he has an entirely different function in the novel. And in Huckleberry Finn, I regard as a coming of age novel. I'm also not the first scholar to point out Tom Sawyer's a boy's book or that Huckleberry Finn might be a coming of age novel, but I may be the first one to link the fact that Tom Sawyer, the character, changes and functions in a very different way between the two novels. And this has everything to do with the fact that one is a boy's book and the other is a coming of age novel. So when Tom Sawyer, who in the novel is a rascal, he's a rascal, he's a lovable little scamp, he's just a boy being a boy. He's doing hand in the cookie jar kind of antics. He's just a kid growing up like all of us did, if we admit it. But when he reappears in Huckleberry Finn, he's not so lovable anymore. He comes back at the beginning as part of Tom Sawyer's gang, but when he reappears in the evasion chapters, he has a different role entirely. He's still a little boy. Huck Finn has undergone a profound experience. He's come to understand the common humanity between himself and a Black American. And that is a profound thing for a 19th century child to comprehend in spite of all the teaching and his culture. And so here's Huckleberry Finn, who toward the end of the novel is mature. He's rejecting society. He's rejecting the bigotry, the racism, the cant, religious cant, and everything else that he's been taught. And he's going to light out for the territories. But all through the evasion chapters, he's under the spell of Tom Sawyer, who continues engaging in these antics, but he's doing it while Jim, a human being, is suffering as a result. And that portrays Tom in a very different light. He's still the same kid, but he's not as likable anymore because his role has changed. And in a boy's book at the end, the adults return and take over control. And the boy is he's a little wiser than he was at the beginning, but he's not mature. He's still a boy. At the end of Huckleberry Finn, or at the end of a coming of age novel, the boy has grown up to some degree. He's matured. He's learned some lesson. He's now on the cusp of manhood. He's going to leave his home and his family and take a job or go to school or marry. He's ready to start his life. Tom Sawyer is at the end of Huckleberry Finn is not ready to do that. Huck Finn is ready to reject everything, light out for the territories, and you have no doubt that he intends to do it. Tom Sawyer, when he's in the boys' book, he's the hero. When he shows up in the coming of age novel, Huckleberry Finn, he functions just as a foil for Huckleberry Finn. And I defend the evasion chapters as an essential part of the novel because it allows Twain to bring Tom Sawyer back into the story along with Huckleberry Finn and place them side by side so you can see one versus the other, the boy versus the young man, the immature boy who's still a little bigot, well, I won't use the word, and Huck Finn, who's learned a profound lesson. And so at the end of the novel, you have a different view of Tom Sawyer. Now, to go back to the novel, if all you ever read was the Adventures of Tom Sawyer, and you never read Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, you would still love Tom. Tom would just be a boy being a boy, and that would be the end of it. And during Twain's lifetime, let's remember, Tom Sawyer outsold Huckleberry Finn. Many more readers knew Tom Sawyer, but didn't know him as a character in Huckleberry Finn. Many did, but not as many. More people knew him as Tom Sawyer of the boy book, not Tom Sawyer the foil in Huckleberry Finn. That situation has reversed now, of course, because more people know and are familiar with Huckleberry Finn. But if a reader only knows Tom from the novel, from the confines of the Adventures of Tom Sawyer. That's how you know him, and that's how you can regard him. If you've read Huckleberry Finn, you have a different take on Tom Sawyer. I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm not saying that you have to study him in the context of Huckleberry Finn. You can look at Tom Sawyer, how he functions in the novel, and leave it at that. The novel, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, is a brilliant masterpiece just on its own terms, even if Twain had never used the character again and had never written Huckleberry Finn. But he did. He did use the character again. He didn't seem to know what to do with him. He brought him back. He used him different ways. And Tom never changes. He's still trying evasions and antics in those other fragments, in those other books, Tom Sawyer Abroad, Tom Sawyer Detective, and so on. Less so in Tom and Huck Among the Indians. And so it changes the view of how you think about Tom Sawyer. And I just wanted to emphasize those things in my essay because I think it adds a dimension to Tom Sawyer that you don't have if you just read The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and go no further, or don't think about him in any other context, because boys do grow up. Twain at the end of the novel added an unnumbered chapter, a very brief little chapter at the end where or a notice, I guess, saying that he's ending the novel now because it's a boy's book and Tom is just a boy, and to bring him into manhood wouldn't be appropriate, wouldn't be right. And that, I think, is telling that Mark Twain wanted us to look at Tom Sawyer just in the context of that novel, even though he came back later and used the character over and over again. I think the Davises talk about Tom Sawyer as a franchise. John Bird talks about Tom Sawyer in a different way and points out very perceptively that in The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, you come to know Tom through his inner life and his feelings and how he reacts to things. You don't get that in the later versions of Tom Sawyer. When he reappears in these later works, you only see him as a character, a function, an automaton, sort of a character. You don't get his inner life or his feelings about things. You just watch him go through the motion and perform his role. And so I think that there are two approaches to Tom Sawyer, the character, and The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, the novel. And that was my contribution to that. But I would urge anybody and the other essays in the book do deal with the novel itself. So I would urge anybody to look at those separately, to read the chapters and the essays in the book that just consider the novel, and then look at my essay and the Davises essay and John Bird's essay that deal with Tom Sawyer, the character. And there may be other essays that deal with Tom Sawyer, the character. I hope I'm not leaving any out, but those are the ones that I'm remembering off the top of my head right at the moment. And I will pass it on to Barb.
Excuse me just for a moment, Kevin. It's actually John Bird who used the term franchise in his essay.
What was it, John?
Yeah.
Okay.
Barb?
Yeah, he called it a franchise. And then the Davises talked about Tom Sawyer being commercialized and how the character lived on and on and on. And there are things, he gets used in advertising. He just reappeared over and over and over outside the novel in ways that were not connected to any work of literature. If you've watched my presentation on Mark Twain in the Marketplace, there's ample evidence of the commercial exploitation of the character of Tom Sawyer that has nothing to do with literature or the novel.
Barb?
Okay, I guess I'll begin by saying I got to know Kent back in the mid-90s when he was he had just finished up Mark Twain A to Z and was contemplating a revised edition. And he gave me a list of names. He said, I need help on fleshing out the stories of these. And one of them was illustrator True Williams. And this was prior to universities having access to WorldCat, where everybody could go in and look up True Williams on WorldCat and see what he had done. But I had friends in the library at Tarleton, and they got into their databases, and we found a lot of information on True Williams that had not been published before. And some of it went into the Oxford edition of Tom Sawyer, and more recently, a Norton Critical edition with an essay by Susan Gannon, which is an excellent wrap-up of some of my previous research and that of Beverly David. So when Ken approached me again for an essay on illustrators, and I saw what had been done before, and I thought we've got to do more so we don't compete with ourselves, basically. So what I proposed was, let's look at everybody. Let's see why publishers chose who they did. And of course, it boiled down to me to making money. The publishers, after True Williams edition faded, they went to a limited edition, signed, autographed by illustrators. And the first one they chose was John George Brown. He was a Briton. And I didn't particularly like his work. It looked too British to me. And the next edition in 1910 came out with Worth Bream. And it didn't sell well because the cover was red cloth. And so American Publishing Company, that's it. They said, we need a colored illustration on the cover. So they had Worth Bream do a color illustration, and it sold out. But we traced more and more the prominent illustrators of the day, how they got their job, why the publishers picked them. We covered covers by N.C. Wyeth, of course, the Norman Rockwell illustrated edition is most familiar to a lot of people because of the postage stamp from Tom Sawyer that was made from Norman Rockwell's work. And then there was Thomas Hart Benton, who was a rebel in his day. And we were lucky enough to find that the publisher George Macy's papers have been archived at the University of Texas, the Harry Ransom Center. So I was able to go through all of the correspondence between Macy and Norman Rockwell and Thomas Hart Benton, and seeing how much those guys were paid and what Macy told them to do and what he wanted. And the instruction was, we don't care about the text. We want to sell pretty books. And so that's what they worked on. And another aspect of it was to make it limited. If it's hard to get a hold of, we can get more money for it. So they limited the numbers of these illustrated editions and more or less made them high dollar. And some of them are even very collectible today, as I'm sure Kevin can tell you. And then we touched on the comic book editions. And in the 1940s and 50s, the comics got in trouble because they were focusing on violence. And we had a psychologist, Frederick Wortham, who went on TV before Congress, and he said, violent comics are ruining our teenagers, and we've got to quit that. So for a while, Comics Illustrated went to more modern, quiet, toned down, nonviolent covers. We got into some of the modern day illustrators, and what I was wanting to find was their personal impressions, what motivated them. And we were very lucky, I was very lucky to find some memoirs by Barry Mosher, who I think did an outstanding job of his edition of Tom Sawyer, especially his theory was, I want to take the text from where it is to where it ain't. I'm going to add and enhance something that Mark Twain never told the reader, but it's there and I see it in my mind. And some of his illustrations of characters are really outstanding. And then we were lucky to find another documentary by an illustrator called C.F. Payne. And his motivation, he said, was, I don't want to compete with Norman Rockwell. I will not get into a foot race with him because I'm going to lose. But Payne is one of the more modern illustrations, set of illustrations, and I was really impressed with Payne's work. But overall, the body of illustration that I found was geared to making the publisher some money, making it hard to get, finding the most famous artist of the day, and let's put it together in a package that will sell. And I think that in a way has contributed to continuing to keep Tom Sawyer in the reading public's eye.
Was it back to me?
Back to you, Kent.
You got it.
In my preliminary remarks, I realized that I overlooked some of the major contributions to the book, so maybe this is a good time to mention them. We've been talking here a little bit about Tom Sawyer as a boy's book and haven't said anything about female characters in the book, which is kind of striking because one of Mark Twain's most famous characters is obviously Becky Thatcher, who is Tom's girlfriend in the novel. An incident with Becky Thatcher is very influential in my own life. And my first reading of Tom Sawyer, I talk about this in several places, including the contributor notes to this book. The first time I read Tom Sawyer, there's a scene in chapter 20 where Becky has accidentally torn the page of the schoolmaster's anatomy book, a book that he surreptitiously reads while the children are busy. Children in the classroom have always wondered what this book is about. And one lunch hour, Becky goes into the classroom by herself and finds the desk unlocked, takes the book out, and then Tom comes in and startles her, and she jerks and tears the page. Tom and Becky have just had a terrible falling out. And as a 9-year-old boy reading the book 70 years ago, I had no sympathy whatever for Becky. I thought of her as a complete wimp. And when the teacher discovers the damage to his book, he goes down the rows of children in the classroom and asks each one, Amy Lawrence, did you tear this book? She cowers and shakes and says no, and then moves to the next one and the next one, moving ever closer to Becky. And we're seeing this in the novel through Tom's eyes. He's watching and he's anticipating with some glee that Becky going to crack under the teacher's pressure and she's going to get a whipping. And he has nothing but contempt for her. What's a whipping, he thinks to himself. And as I read that the first time, I was thinking essentially the same thing. What's the big deal? Girls are basically wimpy little characters. He deserves what she's going to get. But remarkably, by the time the teacher gets to Becky and leans over here and says, Rebecca Thatcher, did you tear this book? And she's visibly shaking. Fright. Suddenly, Tom jumps up and says, I done it. That so surprised me. I'm not exaggerating when I say I almost fell out of my chair. And as I said in the contributor notes to this book, that moment when Tom yells, I done it, didn't improve my grammar education, but it started me off with an understanding of the power of literature. Well, happily, now 70 years later, we have a new perspective on Becky. Linda Morris contributed an article, I'm sorry, looking to the side here to read the table of contents. Her chapter is Becky Thatcher and Aunt Polly in 3 dimensions. What is that you're holding up, Kevin?
That's Tom saying, I done it.
Which edition is that?
That's the great big limited edition by Jim Renner.
Uh-huh. In this case, it's not the
A very big book.
Drew Williams illustration. In Linda's essay, she analyzes, she reads essentially between the lines about Becky and Aunt Polly, of course, being Tom's aunt with whom he's living. And Linda makes a very strong case that both of these characters, Becky and Polly, are much stronger characters than one might suspect. And again, that's another eye-opening essay in this book, that there's really a lot more to these characters than one might suspect. A second essay by Hannah Wells, a Baylor graduate student, or perhaps she's got her degree by now, I don't know, is on family issues. That was a subject I wanted to be sure to include in the book. Her topic is titled Republican Motherhood and Tom Sawyer's Political Education. And she really looks hard at family connections and issues in her essay. And that, of course, brings out more thoughts about Aunt Polly and other female characters. One of the striking things about Tom Sawyer as a whole is how few strong father figures there are in Tom's town. The fictional town in Tom Sawyer's model, Mark Twain's hometown of Hannibal, Missouri, it's called St. Petersburg in the novel. And it's often been described as a matriarchy where most of the strong adult characters are women. There are hardly any whole families in Hannibal, or sorry, in St. Petersburg. Obviously, Tom lives in quite an interesting mix. He lives with his aunt, who's described as his dead mother's sister. Polly seems to have had no children of her own. There's no indication she was ever married. The other people living in the house are his half-brother, Sid, but the nature of their relationship isn't spelled out. If they're half-brothers, they share one parent, but which parent is it? And what's the significance of that question? And another character in the house is described as Tom's cousin, Mary. Her specific relationship to anybody else isn't spelled out either. She's a cousin, but who are her parents? Hannah looks at all these interrelationships and comes up with a novel idea, which is so striking and so spectacular. I hesitate to mention it here now. You have to read her essay to see what she suggests. An exciting conclusion. Another essay that I haven't mentioned before is Tom Sawyer's complicated relationship with Mark Twain's hometown. Hannibal, Missouri has been identified with Mark Twain since Mark Twain became popular in the late 19th century. It is celebrated as Mark Twain's home, and in fact, it's been called America's hometown, as kind of the idyllic mid-American place for a family to grow up, which is kind of ironic in view of the fact that there's so few whole families in the novel. Cindy Lovell, who was the executive director of the Mark Twain Boyhood Home and Museum in Hannibal, wrote this essay. She looks at a lot of interesting issues in the history of the relationship between the town, Mark Twain, and Tom Sawyer. It hasn't been strictly a loving relationship, a lot of complications. And am I overlooking anything? Kevin mentioned John and Hugh Davis's article titled Tom Sawyer is an Enduring Icon of Boyhood. And a very important essay. Shouldn't overlook this one. Harry Driscoll wrote about what Tom Sawyer has to say about Indians. As Pat mentioned, the arch enemy, the central fright figure in Tom Sawyer is called Injun Joe, who's described as a murderous half-breed. He's the fellow who kills the doctor in the graveyard and then puts the blame on Muff Potter. And when Tom finally testifies in Muff Potter's murder trial and reveals that it was Joe who killed the doctor, Joe bolts from the courtroom, spectacular scene of jumping out of the window and running off. And then he's not seen or heard from for a while, but he remains a lurking background figure in the novel where Tom is having nightmares about Joe murdering him. And there finally are confrontations toward the end of the book. But that helps give the story a lot of focus. Tom is constantly worried about Injun Joe. Well, what Carrie Driscoll, who has written a masterpiece of a study of Indians and Mark Twain. A copy of it right here, since this is show and tell. This is a book that anyone interested in Native Americans should take a close look at. Carrie's obviously the best qualified person to write about Indians in Tom Sawyer. There was a real life man in Hannibal, Missouri, named Joe Douglas, who became known as Injun Joe. And there's a lot of question of whether Mark Twain modeled his fictional Injun Joe on that real life figure. And Carrie shows that this was an impossibility. It couldn't be. And a final essay in the book, which I think is very important, especially for teachers. John Pascal, a high school teacher in New Jersey, who's become a Mark Twain scholar in his own right, has been teaching a dedicated Mark Twain course in this high school, possibly, maybe probably the only high school course dedicated solely to Mark Twain. John's been doing this for 7 years. His essay is really a very illuminating and lively description of techniques that he's used in his class. It titled the essay, Adventuring with Tom Sawyer in a 21st Century Classroom, where he goes through step by step the issues that he's covered. I think even people who aren't involved in teaching will find this an exciting essay of what you can do to stimulate interest in the novel and Mark Twain. And then a final piece that isn't strictly an essay, we put it in the resources section, is a first-person account of the cave in Tom Sawyer. Those of you who have read Tom Sawyer are familiar with the fact that the dramatic conclusion of the climax of the novel comes when Tom and Becky get lost in this mammoth limestone cave just outside of St. Petersburg. That cave was modeled on a real cave outside of Hannibal, Missouri, a cave in which Mark Twain himself spent a lot of time as a youth. So a young fellow who's a lifelong resident of Hannibal named Danny Norman, who I've gotten to know over the years, wrote on that. Danny spent a lot of time as a boy on outings in the cave. And then when he went to college, he graduated from the University of Missouri recently. During the summer, he came back to Hannibal and worked as a guide in the cave. And what he's done in his chapter is to give a very, very intimate look at the realities of the cave and how the real cave compares to the fictional cave in the novel. They're clearly not the same. And that's kind of illuminating too, and that as you look at the differences between the real cave and the fictional cave, you get some idea of what Mark Twain himself invented to make the cave scenes a little more lively. And to make his piece even more interesting, Danny comments on a number of films of Tom Sawyer in which they have very important cave scenes. If you've seen any Tom Sawyer films in which Tom and Becky are lost in the cave, I can assure you that the caves that you've seen in the films look absolutely nothing like the real cave. That's a fun subject. So I think we're at a point now, Jody, if you want to open this to questions, we can get this moving along.
Absolutely. So you were just talking about it a second ago, but one of our guests asked if you guys can address the depiction of Injun Joe in the Adventures of Tom Sawyer. I'm not sure if that's the illustrations that Barbara were talking about, or just kind of, maybe this is a question more for Carrie, but talk a little bit more about his depiction in the book.
So you mean the question is, how does the fictional Injun Joe relate to the real life Injun Joe? Is that?
Potentially, I think it just says, can you address the depiction of Injun Joe?
The depiction of Injun Joe in novel is rather limited. He is introduced as kind of a mysterious character, somebody who's been around St. Petersburg for a long time and is known as a criminal figure who apparently has never been prosecuted, And there are rumors that I think the number is he's rumored to have been responsible for the murders of 5 local people. And he doesn't really get charged with anything until Muff Potter is put on trial for murdering Dr. Robinson in the graveyard.
Yeah.
And that doesn't come to anything in the courts because Joe immediately bolts out of the window and disappears. He later returns to St. Petersburg in a disguise as the term they use in the novel is deaf and dumb Spaniard. Huck and Tom recognize him and start trailing him around for complicated reasons I don't want to go into now. It has to do with Joe and a new partner about whom we know almost nothing have found a valuable treasure, and Huck and Tom want to get at the treasure, which is one of the key plot elements in the novel. Oh, this is holding up the True Williams picture of Joe bolting out the window.
Yeah.
I have a special interest in that myself because of my interest in films, and I make a point about this in my essay on the Tom Sawyer films, that in several of the films, including the 1938 Selznick Tom Sawyer, before Joe jumps out the window, he throws a knife at Tom. Is up on the witness stand, and he's watching Joe as Tom is nervously trying to tell his story. We see Joe handling a sharp knife and looking maliciously at Tom. And then as Tom is about to identify Joe as the killer, Joe throws the knife, misses Tom's head, and then he runs and jumps out the window. That scene occurs in several films, but in the novel, he doesn't throw a knife at Tom. And despite the fact that the rest of the story, Tom is scared to death that Joe's going to come after him, there's really no evidence that Joe is trying to get Tom. There's a scene where Huck and Tom are digging for a pirate treasure, and they go in the town's haunted house. And while they're in the house, Joe returns to his partner, and the boys overhear him, the men talking about themselves, talking about Tom and Huck, and how irritating it is that they have these boys digging outside the house. But Joe says nothing about trying to get Tom. And there's really, I'm not saying that he doesn't want to get Tom, but there's really not a scrap of evidence in the novel that Joe has any interest in getting Tom, but that gets played up mightily in all the films.
If you want to go back to the theme of idyllic dream versus nightmare, he clearly is a nightmare figure. It's almost like it's that boogeyman out there that we've never seen. We don't know what it is. It lives under the bed. We're not sure it's going to get us someday. I mean, that was kind of his role, I think, through most of the text. Tom was so afraid that he was out there somewhere and he was going to get him. But whether he wanted to or not, different story.
I could just throw in a completely off the wall aside here. I recently discovered a film which you can see for free on Amazon Prime. It's called The Adventures of Thomasina Sawyer, in which the Tom Sawyer character is a girl. And the brother changes, and I was going to say his brother, Thomasina Sawyer's sibling, Sid, is also a girl. And Polly is also a woman, so they didn't change everything. But another change in that story, which is really bizarre, is that there's an Indian Joe character in there. He's identified, I believe, he's identified as Cherokee. And one of the surprises in the book is we discover that Indian Joe is Huck's father. And that Huck, like his father, Indian Joe, speaks Cherokee. So if you're looking for something a different take on Tom Sawyer, look out for The Adventures of Thomasina Sawyer. That answer your question about Indian Joe, Jody?
I think so, unless Barbara has anything to add about the illustrations that were being held up and thoughts on how he's depicted pictorially.
It was very interesting to see how each illustrator depicted Joe. The one I was holding up was Barry Mosier's.
Yeah.
And he had him smoking a corncob pipe.
Yeah.
And The ones that Kevin was holding up was from a very, very rare edition by an illustrator named Jim Rimmer. And Kevin is probably one of the only people that has a copy of that edition because it is extremely rare and handmade. But Jim's edition has Injun Joe as a very frightening type individual. And some of the illustrators portrayed Joe with the headband and true Indian garb, and others like True Williams, you couldn't even tell that he was any different from any other man in the village in some of True Williams's illustrations of Joe sitting in the graveyard after they had murdered a man. He looks like any other citizen in Hannibal. So it's how the individual artist interpreted Twain's words, and they varied widely.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. So the next question says it's for Kevin. And it says, was the confusion in the change of Tom Sawyer's personality in Huck Finn partially due to Tom representing civilization and its inhumane laws as a counterpoint to Huck Finn being the uncivilized and emotionally human towards Jim?
Well, Tom Sawyer in the novel, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, as John Bird points out, you get to see his inner life and his thoughts and his feelings. When he shows up in Huckleberry Finn, you don't get any of that. All you get is the character. You see his actions. You don't know how he feels about anything. He lectures Huck about novels and doing it by the book. You watch all of his antics, but you don't get any sense of his inner life at that point. And so he's really the same kid in both novels. And that's kind of important to remember. It's just that when he shows up in Huckleberry Finn, he's no longer the hero of a boy's book. In the boy's book, he's just a boy being a boy. But if you're in a coming of age novel and you're just a boy being a boy and you don't change and you don't enter into manhood or mature or move in that direction at all, which Tom does not, then you're kind of a fish out of water. And so Tom functions really in Huckleberry Finn as a symbol of civilization, a symbol of somebody who believes in all of the cant and all of the romance popular in boys' books and novels of that time. And he basically comes back in the evasion chapters to remind readers of all of the things that Huckleberry Finn is going to reject at the end of that novel, and why Huck, because of the profound experience that he's had going down the river with Jim and coming to see Jim as a paternal father figure, that is why Huckleberry Finn rejects everything he's been shown in civilization and society. And at the end of the novel, there's Huck saying, I'm going to light out for the territory, and you believe he probably will. And there's Tom going right back to where the adults take over, just like in a traditional boys' book. And so he really functions as a foil. He's great for contrasting and making Huck the hero of Huckleberry Finn. But that does detract, if you're reading Huckleberry Finn, it detracts from Tom's character. But keep in mind, if Mark Twain had never written anything but The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and stopped there, and had never written Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer Abroad and Tom Sawyer Detective and Tom and the Indians and Tom Sawyer's Conspiracy and all the fragments, if all we had was that novel, he's a lovable little scamp. He's a lovable little guy. He's just a kid, and he's doing all the stuff that kids do. The problem is he doesn't grow up. Kind of not quite a Peter Pan character, but maybe a proto Peter Pan, I guess, in a sense. He just doesn't grow up. He's just a kid. So he's a symbol of all those things in Huckleberry Finn. But let's not forget that that's why he was so popular during Twain's lifetime. That's why it was a best-selling book, because of all the boys' books, and there were many of them, and I discussed them in my essay and give the whole history of boys' books and all the elements of boys' books and compare them to coming-of-age novels. And I get into all of the details of that. But that's why readers loved him. That's why readers enjoyed it so much. when you read Huckleberry Finn, if you're an admirer of Tom Sawyer, it kind of spoils the illusion. It kind of spoils it for you. And so that's why I say you can look at him just as the character in the novel, or you can look at the character and then how he evolves but doesn't evolve. He doesn't change, but his role changes later on.
So this question, it's addressed to Kent, but anybody that's read Carrie's book can pop in your opinion as well. It says, does Carrie's book help the reader to understand Mark Twain's extreme animosity in his life towards Indians in contrast to his sympathy for Black Americans?
Anybody else want to take that question?
Are you sending that question to me? Or
If you want to take it, yeah.
Go for it, Barb.
I think Carrie's book covered well the battle that Clemens felt within himself regarding Indians. You know, she covered both sides, and her conclusion was that he never resolved the split in the way his emotions ran. I believe one of his ancestors had been murdered savagely by Indians, and he had seen them when he had gone west. And then his daughter Jean was very sympathetic to some of the Indian causes. So Carrie does well trying to explain the battle within Clemens's own psyche. And I think her conclusion was he never really clearly resolved it.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah. Very, very well put. This wasn't a question in the Q and answer, but it was in the chat. And I would really like to hear Pat's take on this for dream versus reality a little bit, and then anybody else who wants to jump in. I think we've all been to the caves, but it says the cave basically as a representation of a labyrinth. The labyrinth is Injun Joe, a latter-day Minotaur.
Oh, I don't know that I have enough reference material to de-ravel that question. Okay. Yeah. So yeah. So. How about some of my better educated colleagues? Maybe they can take a run. I'm trying to think through the Minotaur thing.
If I could jump in on here,
Yeah.
It's a good idea to differentiate between the novel and the films, because in the novel, Tom and Becky are lost in the cave for a few days, and Tom, one of his admirable things is figuring out a way to get out of the cave, and he goes off looking for an exit, and he sees Injun Joe. Joe is carrying a torch, I guess, and Tom sees it, and his first reaction is to call out before he realizes who it is. But when he realizes it's Joe, he naturally doesn't want to have his presence known. But Joe doesn't make a move toward him. When Joe hears a voice, he, after all, is a wanted man. He turns around and flees, and that's the last you see of Joe in the cave. Till later, after Tom and Becky are rescue themselves, and then they come back. Tom, of course, is after he recovers from this ordeal in the cave, learns that Judge Thatcher put an iron door on the main entrance of the cave. And Tom's reaction to that is he's horrified, and he blurts out that Injun Joe is in the cave. So everybody rushes to the cave, they open the door, and what do they find? They find Joe's dead body, because Joe was trying to get out of the cave and he couldn't get through that door, and he basically starves to death or dies of thirst at the entrance. And that's the last of Joe. But one of the interesting things, incidentally, about Joe in the cave is that when Tom and Becky find their way out, they discover they were 5 miles south of or 5 miles down the river from the main entrance. But Joe doesn't know any other way to get out of the cave. He had to go back to the main entrance. And does it make sense that Joe would go 5 miles into the cave to hide the treasure? If you've been in the cave, if you've been in the real cave, you know how long it takes to walk through there. It would take an enormous amount of time to walk through 5 miles of those passages. And he's supposed to be carrying 50 pounds of treasure? I don't think so. To me, it's an example of Mark Twain's carelessness with details about things like that.
I don't think you can draw a parallel between Injun Joe and the Minotaur, although it is tempting, and simply because of the outcome and because the danger was mostly in Tom Sawyer's mind. Whereas if you're in a labyrinth with a Minotaur, you are in danger, according to the legend. And I would suggest anybody that wants to pursue that, however, and prove me wrong, is to take a look at Alan Gribben's book on Mark Twain's literary resources, the third volume that has, or the second volume that has come out. Great, I don't have a copy here handy, but it's a big fat volume. It is thoroughly indexed, about a fourth of the book or more. There we go, there it is an index in the back. And I will say, because I have some of them, Mark Twain was extremely conversant and well-read in Greek and Roman classics and mythology. He had those books in his library, he marked them, he read them, he alludes to them in his other works. And so I would have no doubt that Mark Twain was familiar with the legend of the Minotaur, but I would urge anybody that wants to climb out on that limb and write an essay in that direction to first go to Alan Gribben's book and look at all the Greek and Roman classics and that he had in his library, and see if you can get some concrete evidence of Twain actually having the legend of the Minotaur in one of those books. I think he probably knew the story. I think you can certainly probably make that case and find some reasonably good evidence. Although I don't know that I would agree with the parallel between Injun Joe and the Minotaur.
Interesting. It's definitely, I mean, I think as Ken said, the difference between the book and the movie, because in the movie, Joe is such a more dangerous figure towards Tom that you could almost make it for the movie in some ways, but when you actually look at the book, it's not quite there. So very interesting. Definitely.
That illustration that I held up from the Jim Rimmer book showing Injun Joe holding the knife up, I don't think that happens in the novel. That's part of Tom Sawyer's dream that Injun Joe is coming after him. And so the danger is imagined more than it's real, as Kent mentioned.
But that's what boyhood is all about, imagining things that are not always real.
He's a boy.
Yeah.
So I could just make one quick comment here. As some of you are aware, I've been writing a lot about film adaptations of Mark Twain's work, and I know there are many scholars that think that the films are irrelevant to understanding Mark Twain, but we've just discussed, I think, is evidence that the films have influenced perceptions of Mark Twain in his books, because some of the ideas people have about Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn come not from the books, but from the film adaptations.
Yeah. Well, we are basically out of time. So I want to thank all of our panelists for coming on tonight to talk about this book. And I encourage our audience to, I guess you're all at home, but read your copy of Adventures of Tom Sawyer and then read these essays and then read it again to see if you come up with any new ideas on or new insights for yourself. It is available. I'll post the link back in the chat before we end, and thank you everybody for joining us.
Just one last comment on the availability of the book. I've just learned that the book is still not listed on Amazon. Our editor at Salem Press says there's some kind of screw up there. I don't know what it is. It makes no sense to me, because often books are listed on Amazon well before they're published. However, if anybody wants information about the book or ordering, you can go to salempress.com, the publisher's website, and there's a full page with a lot of information about the book there.
Yep, and I just dropped that link into the chat for anybody that's watching, so they can go directly there right now to get it.
Cool. I'd like to thank everybody who's been watching this.
Awesome. Well, good night, everybody.
Oh, we're supposed to do that.
Yeah, do that.
Son.
We still hear each other?
I can hear you. I can see you.
That's
I think we're off
exciting.
air.
Are we supposed to